Hi, I'm Rylee. This summer I had the pleasure of working out in some of Boulder's rangelands and investigating what's going on with some of the plants out there. So, rangelands make up about 30% of American land. I don't know if you knew that. Something you probably do know is that climate change is causing more frequent and longer lasting droughts. And so we wanted to investigate the correlation between the grazing, dry spells, that are all occurring at the same time on our local rangelands. And because they are so important in agriculture and in our economy, it's very important that we confirm that there is in fact a correlation between these factors. And hopefully, using this data, we can help our ranchers better manage their rangelands to minimize the effects of these dry spells and grazing. So the main question that we asked was, how do short-term dry spells in combination with grazing affect above ground and below ground productivity in rangeland plants? And something to note is that we did separate below ground and above ground productivity, which hasn't really been investigated so much in the past, and it will in fact make a difference later on. As far as our experiment goes, we had, it's a little bit messed up there, but we had 4 sites. Each site is broken up into 4 different quadrants, and within each quadrant there are 8 plots. And you can see right there they correlate to these different dry spell treatments. Depending on the season, so for example, early season, which was what I was present for and what we'll be focusing on, we put these plastic sheets that covered the plots and effectively simulated a drought. Blocking the bottom from any sort of rainfall. As well as that, on alternating sides of the quadrants, we would inflict a graze on the plots. We did actually have real cows out there to graze, but the cows showed up late for their job during the early season, so I was the cow. I went in with a weed whacker and I physically weed whacked all the plots. But for the purposes of our experiment, they do the same thing. For our methods of collecting data, we used a soil moisture probe to collect the volumetric water content found in the plots. Essentially just how much water is in it at a given time. We use this to confirm that our plots were in fact having an effect on the plot below. We also had these root ingrowth cores that we put in the corners of each of the plots. Essentially they're these little mesh bags. We put them in a hole in the ground and we fill them back up with dirt. And during the period that they are buried, the roots would grow in. And this is essentially a more isolated and controlled way of measuring the amount of root biomass in a given area. In the past, studies like this, what they do is they kind of just dig a hole in the ground and pull it up, and they haven't found any correlations between their treatments and the root biomass, probably because they've been getting years and years of other biomass that has been growing in there. So we did ours a little bit differently to avoid that. As well as that, for our above ground productivity methods, we took NDVI, which is essentially how much green light is being reflected off of the plants. The more green light there is, we can assume that there's more photosynthesis going on, and therefore the plants are more productive. We also took plant heights around the soil cores to kind of get a good measurement for that. So when we took our VWC, or volumetric water content, we did in fact find a correlation between the treatment and how much water was in the soil. So you can see up here, the C is our control, the E is our early season. You can see the control is consistently higher because it was uncovered, and the early season is consistently lower. And as well as that, you can see here there was a spike because we did get rainfall, confirming that yes, when there is more moisture, the water content will go up, which was good. It means that our experiment is effective. For our above ground biomass, We didn't find large significant trends, but we did find some significant trends between the graze and dry spell treatments. You can see here, grazing had a significant effect on the NDVI, and the dry spell had an effect on the plant heights. However, the most interesting finding that we did find was the root biomass. You can see, even just visually, there is a distinct difference between our control and our early season. The early season is significantly lower, meaning that these plants were not investing anything in their roots if it was too dry, at least with the early season dry spell. And this could have all sorts of interesting implications, but just to reiterate, the VWC varies with treatment and weather, which is good because it confirms that our treatments are having an effect. Through these results, we can also conclude that below ground productivity is significantly affected by the early season dry spell. And while there isn't as much of an effect from like the dry spell on certain aspects of the above ground biomass, grazing I think did have a little bit more of an effect than on the above ground. So grasslands mostly are producing underground, and that's probably why we saw such a significant difference between the treatments and the control in this case, because most of their activity is happening below ground, and that's probably why the above ground stays so consistent. This lack of root growth could be indicative of a long-term health, which would be not ideal. Obviously, our rangelands are very important, and if there is a large amount of future die-off, that is not only good for or bad for the livestock that is being grazed and those ranchers who rely on that, but also just in a ecological sense. As well as that, our rangelands, the local plants are very important in anchoring the soil. And if these plants are not investing in their roots, they're not going to be as well anchored. And this could lead to erosion rates increasing exponentially, especially with the cows also grazing, pulling up these plants that are not anchored, and basically just increasing the chance of an erosion event going on. In fact, the short-term dry spells that we were mimicking in this experiment are actually fairly similar to the ones that they're found before the Dust Bowl happened. Obviously, we were doing a lot of other unsustainable practices at the time that probably increased that chance of that event happening, but it is still probably important to note that these short-term dry spells do seem to be having this specific effect on below-ground productivity. In the future, it probably wouldn't be important to look at the timing of these dry spells. Obviously, there is a mid and late season that will be going on later on throughout the summer. Perhaps we'll find that, in the mid-season, these roots actually do a lot better. And in the late season, they do bad again. That'll be something that we'll just have to see. But hopefully, we will find that certain seasons will interact with these plants better. And we can then tell our ranchers to go, hey, send your cows out at this time of year to affect the plants like the least amount. If they're more anchored during a mid-season drought, then you need to let your cows out at a mid-season drought to like avoid the effects of this stuff. Yeah, but anyway, I just wanted to thank Dana, Alicia, Tom, and Katie. You guys were amazing, and I'm so glad to be a part of this program. Thank you.